My name is John Wright. I'm Professor Emeritus here at the university, where I served as a faculty member for over 35 years, prior to which I was a faculty member at Carleton College for 10 years, where I initiated its program major in African American and African Studies. Prior to that, I was an undergraduate and graduate student at the University of Minnesota from 1963 to 1973. I earned an undergraduate degree in what was then the Institute of Technology. Now it's the College of Science and Engineering. I was an undergraduate electrical engineering major. I had a short stint in the MBA program in the business school as a graduate student during the Vietnam War years, but changed directions dramatically in graduate school and turned to do a master's degree in English and American literature. And because at the time, and this is again the late 60s and early 70s, because there were no programs in African American African studies, I then, after completing the master's in English and American literature, was able to cobble together a PhD program in the history of African peoples and American studies. And that then would complete my undergraduate years on campus. As an undergraduate student, again, I was a freshman in the fall of 1963. And one of the clearest memories for me that year was in November, walking up down the mall on Northrop Auditorium, front of Northrop Auditorium, and hearing the news that John Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. Those years, my undergraduate years between 63 and 1968, were the years of what came to be called the long, hot summers. Although that freshman year of mine had begun right after the March on Washington of 1963, which had culminated, of course, in Martin King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Nonetheless, the next 5 years when I was an undergraduate were populated in part by a series of long, hot summers, massive urban rebellions. And during the summers of 1964, 65, 66, 67, and 68, which culminated in the Kerner Commission, Presidential Kerner Commission on Civil Disorders, that was my generation's first such major assessment of the causes of civil disorder and of course, the history of white supremacy in this country and all the continuing problems with social justice and police reform and so on. I can continue in terms of background here. Again, I became a member of the Black Student Organization at the university, which then was called Students for Racial Progress. Our acronym was STRAP. We began contributing members and resources to the Southern Freedom Rides then in attempts to confront Southern de jure segregation in a variety of forms. But we began after the Southern Civil Rights Movement led by Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and John Lewis and an array of others, after it shifted its focus from the de jure Jim Crow South to the de facto Jim Crow North. And the years of my undergraduate experience, those years again of long, hot summers, of major rebellions and disorders, also accompanied by the rise of the Black Power movement, which became a direct challenge to the ideology and strategy and tactics of the civil rights movement that Dr. King and his other colleagues led at that point in time. And we began developing then a dramatically different perspective on the issues of social justice and race relations in this country. We renamed our student group the Afro-American Action Committee and set Students for Racial Progress aside. And that part mirrored the impact on us of the rising Black Power movement and of figures like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown and a long list of others, plus our widening global perspective on these issues also, and our increasing sense of alliance with the anti-imperialist movements, decolonization movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Well, they have a number of similarities because this cycle of protest now has a long history in this country, which I hope the members of the teach-in will understand. In my own lifetime, there have been at least 3 major cycles of major urban disorders. And prior to that, in the 20th century, there were another 3 or 4, going back to the very turn of the century and the World War I eras. So this is a syndrome, cyclic syndrome in American life and society. And I haven't talked about the 19th century or before, because the history of these kind of disorders goes back into the 19th and indeed to the end of the 18th century. So we have a very, very long history. But again, as I said, as an undergraduate student, every summer for me from 1965 through 1968 was filled with massive urban disorders, many of them precipitated by police brutality and the murder of unarmed Black citizens. And those disorders, of course, helped increasingly radicalize African Americans in general, not just students on campus. And for those of us who also were from or allied with community social justice groups and racial advancement groups, the old NAACP, the Urban League, and an array of other such organizations, we kept a very close eye on and involvement with their responses to these unresolved basic issues of American social justice. That, of course, remains to be seen. I mean, some of what differentiates the protests of the present from the protests of the 1960s that I and my student generation was engaged in. We have on the one hand, of course, the rise of the internet in the 1990s. And for those of you who were born after 1990, that may not seem the watershed that it does for those of us who are older. But the development of the internet, and with it, of course, even more recent technologies, the technologies of cell phones, and essentially global instantaneous communication has changed the dynamics dramatically. The Rodney King assault that took place in the early, I think 1992, if I recall correctly, was indeed filmed. And of course, the filming of that brutal assault on Rodney King was part of what fueled the riots back in 1992. But the internet wasn't operative then. And the internet now and cell phones, of course, are playing a crucial role in all these instances, because it's no longer simply the word of Black bystanders and their allies against the allegations of police brutality and the attempts to defend the indefensible use of a deadly force by these police. Now we have indisputable video evidence that's being projected around the country and around the world. And that has changed the dynamics dramatically. Also, the student groups and protest groups operating now, unlike our generation, have the technology of social media to organize and develop around and to communicate and so forth. And all these things indeed have helped change the dynamics of between what we did in earlier generations and now. The basic social facts, in many ways, have not changed significantly. And that, of course, is part of what George Floyd's murder makes very clear, because it's part of a long, long, unbroken chain of injustice and brutality. It's a complex question, and reparations movement has developed into a very robust operation now, but it also has a very, very long history. Again, in the 60s, it was associated, the reparations movement was associated largely with Black power cells and organizations and Black arts groups. So there's little comparatively new about it. But even prior to that, In one sense, the issue of reparations goes back to the Civil War, into the Civil War and Reconstruction, when the notion that when 4 million slaves were emancipated, that there should be some compensation for 2.5 centuries of unrequited labor for slave masters and for slave owners. And at that point in time, the issue was in part that the freeings of serfs and slaves in Europe going back to the 16th century had largely been accompanied by land redistribution, and by giving the ex-slaves and ex-serfs whole land holds that could serve them for survival and sustenance and so forth. And that kind of land redistribution, reparations, old style, had been part, of course, of the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in the 1830s. So that issue was revisited after our Civil War, but the idea of 40 acres and a mule for ex-slaves was never, beyond a few brief experiments, developed in this country. Instead, what African Americans received was perhaps the first great federal bureaucracy, the Freedmen's Bureau. That again accompanied the Reconstruction era and the 13th, 14th, and then finally 15th Amendments. So, reparations, like I say, has that kind of history to address also. A lot of the commentators about these protests have marveled at and been strongly bolstered by the size of the current demonstrations and the diversity, the diverse demography of the people participating in it. But the question of the staying power of this movement is, of course, what is issue now and has always been an issue. And in each of the other major cycles during the 20th century, there were massive mobilizations of public support for social justice and for radical change. And in each instance in the past, they have faltered when it comes to maintain the kind of ongoing mobilization in multiple levels, not just in terms of local organization and trying to improve police and community relations and so forth, but the more problematic issues, again, of political and statutory reform that has to happen at the local, at the state level, and at the federal level. And basic principles and practices of policing have to be challenged, indeed rethought in this context. And the ability of young people, all right, young people, students and otherwise, to sustain the enthusiasm for social change, to go to the polls, to actually vote in the process, and to do the long, hard, and oftentimes unglamorous labor. That's is the real long-term challenge, and we won't know until, in fact, those issues are confronted here and now about whether in fact, this current round of protests and rebellions will have a different outcome from its predecessors. I approach these things from a dual perspective. On the one hand, again, I am a trained scholar and a multidisciplinary scholar. I've been studying these issues and teaching about them for my entire career. I was in the classroom for 47 years. And again, help develop the Department of African American and African Studies here, and that the program at Carleton College. And in fact, the Department of African American and African Studies here grew directly out of protest action. All right. The student group that I mentioned earlier on, our student group, which originally been Students for Racial Progress, STRAP, that became the Afro-American Action Committee, we brought Martin Luther King Jr. to the university campus in the spring of 1967, to address the issues of the time then, in the midst of the Vietnam War, and as Dr. King was facing the challenges brought to him and the civil rights outlook and strategy and philosophy, the challenge brought to them by the young Black Power apostles, Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown and the others, who had originally been followers of Dr. King and the old Southern civil rights strategy, but who found that its failures increasingly obvious, particularly as they moved from dealing with trying to desegregate lunch counters and department stores and so on in the Old South, and when they confronted the entrenched patterns of institutional racism in the urban North. And we brought Dr. King here in 1967 to address those issues. And he did so again on the Mall in St. Paul campus to an audience of more than 4,000 students. His position then had become increasingly radical. He was no longer the Dr. King of the 1963 I Have a Dream speech. He was no longer using that metaphor to talk about the issues to be addressed. His metaphor at that point in time was a world house. And the last book he published, which he was writing at the time that we brought him here to campus, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, confronts all of those issues. The month after we brought Dr. King to the university campus, in May of 1967, we brought Stokely Carmichael to the university. And he addressed a crowd in Williams Arena of more than 5,000 packed to the rafters to address these same issues, but again, from the vantage point of Black power. And the significant difference, I think, between the outlooks was that the Black power advocates had increasingly adopted a global perspective, and they saw the problems that African Americans and Native Americans, so forth, facing in this country as less like those of European immigrant groups who had come here, of course, voluntarily and who had been able to assimilate to one degree or another into American society, saw African American problems as more akin to those of deterritorialized, dispossessed, and colonized peoples in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And on the other hand, while they and we admired Dr. King's moral outlook and stance, the dream of the beloved community, the strategy of nonviolent direct action protests, and so forth, those were the limits of those approaches were becoming clearer to us. And Black power was a form of realpolitik, as the Germans began to call it in the 19th century. And the reality is that moral and philosophical and idealistic positions about what society ought to be was not what moved the world, not what moved the society. It was power relations, what people do, and rather than what they say, is what has to be dealt with, and one has to respond accordingly. All right, so hard-nosed pragmatism was to be engaged, and that's the perspective that we increasingly adopted. And when we look at what's happening today, Black Lives Matter, and I've had a number of the students in local Black Lives Matter organization have been students in my classes. They have indeed tried to learn from the earlier generations of protest and rebellion and philosophical and ideological thinking and planning and so forth. And they've incorporated a good deal of it into Black Lives Matter practices. But this is a different era, and you cannot uncritically apply the strategies and tactics and outlook of the past to the problems of the present. On the personal side, on my father's side of the family, I'm a fourth generation Minnesota. My father's people came to Minnesota in the 1870s, during the Reconstruction era, as refugees from Reconstruction era Kentucky. Poverty, disfranchisement, and the denial of basic citizenship rights. And of course, the rising forces of white terrorism, white supremacist terrorism in the Upper South. There were streams of Black folks coming again to the Upper Midwest. And in further west, my grandmother said that her ancestors had gone way out west to Minnesota. And they were refugees, as it were, from the Upper South. And some of them were exodusters who were trying to establish independent all-Black towns and commonwealths in a variety of places in the Midwest and in the far West. From the very beginning, my family ancestors had to battle what scholars are now calling the, quote, Minnesota paradox, unquote. This gap between the professed progressivist democratic ideals of the state and the region on the one hand, and the reality, the pragmatic reality, the way in which the structures of power and opportunity and privilege are arrayed in this place. My, again, oldest ancestors who came were involved in political and civic action in the 1870s and continued to be generation after generation after generation. Every generation has had to battle over issues of social justice, over equity and basic human decency with the state of Minnesota. And that applies, again, to all of our civic institutions. It applies to the police, and it applies to the University of Minnesota. So, that's part of my perspective. I also have a long history of confronting, again, the currents of racism, racial attitudes in the state of Minnesota. I was born into what's called the Phillips neighborhood, all right? Neighborhood named in the honor of Wendell Phillips, the great 19th century Anglo-American abolitionist. The Phillips neighborhood that I grew in, which is on the south side of Minneapolis, near Franklin, Chicago, was a wonderful amalgam of people from a variety of different ethnic and cultural and religious backgrounds. Black folks and white folks and Native Americans, Mexicans, we referred to them then, a few Asians and so forth. I have absolutely no recollections of racial conflict and racial epithets until at the age of 7, when my grandfather died, and my grandparents had owned a farm in Robbinsdale, which is then an independent township, since the World War I era, since 1916. And my parents decided to move us from the city out to the family farm, where we became the lone Black family in the entire Robbinsdale district of 281. And on my very first day in the 2nd grade at school, I confronted, again, what they're now calling the Minnesota paradox, because my teachers had to figure out where to place me at reading level in class and so forth. And so the teacher had me stand up in front of the class and read from the textbooks that the students were using. And she was apparently astonished at how well I read, and proceeded then to give me a more advanced textbook, and then another and another. And I read well from all of them. So well that in my recollection, she then pulled me out of class, had someone come in and take over her class, and then trotted me from one class to the other, asking me to stand in front of the group and read, which I did. I was at age 7. I was, I guess, old enough to take some pride in what was obviously a strong performance on my part, but I wasn't wise enough to know what came next. Because as soon as the kids were released for recess out onto the school playground, and I went out for recess to play, I was immediately surrounded by an assault of N-words from the white students, and had to confront it. Back in the city, my father had taken me to, as a I think as a preschooler, maybe even, to the Elliott Park neighborhood house, a settlement house, and where I became part of a boxing program. And so I knew how to use my fist, and I was stronger and faster than any of the white kids trying to humiliate me. I ended up in 3 fights on the playground at recess and was hauled into the principal's office, all right? And the principals then called my mother to come and retrieve me. I was punished, not the foul-mouthed white kids on the playground who had so misnamed me. So I, at age 7, got an early introduction again to this, quote, Minnesota paradox, unquote. It followed me all of my school days, through elementary school, through junior high, and through high school, and on to the university. So, by the time I was 15 and got my first driver's permit, I became acquainted with police harassment for driving while Black, because policemen from Robbinsdale and Crystal and Golden Valley routinely pulled me over for no reason other than that I was driving in some place where I was not, in their mind, supposed to be. I would have a series of confrontations with police over time in those days. And after the university, when I became involved with the student group, with police, both from the university police force and from the city police, harassing members of our group who were under surveillance during those years, as Black student unions routinely were across the country. In the course of trying to retire from the university, I became part of Professor Rev. Ellen Prell's Campus Divided exhibit, which of course went viral. I was one of the advisors on that project, and I was well aware of the anti-Semitism and racism on the University of Minnesota campus from the 1930s through the 1950s that her exhibit focused on. I was well aware in part because both my father and his younger sister, my aunt, were students at the university in the 1930s, at the height of the Great Depression. And they helped create the very first Black student organization at the University of Minnesota, the Council of Negro Students, in 1937, to confront then the Jim Crow policies of Lotus Kaufman, the longest serving University Minnesota president ever, and his deans and administrators who were basically trying to segregate Black students, to deny them access to basic resources and facilities, not just dormitories, but a whole array of other campus activities at the time. My aunt and my father were central parts of that group. My aunt was the president of the Council of Negro Students and who signed off on the protest against Lotus Kaufman then. These things hadn't changed much between my father's and my aunt's generation and mine when I came to campus in the early 1960s. And ironically, 50 years later, when I was getting ready to retire, these issues came to the fore again. And as the history of the university's complicity with social injustice and institutional racism became clearer, all right, and the students began the process of trying to have buildings associated with the culpable administrators renamed, again, I ended up being called on to address the regents on impromptu basis in a board meeting in the spring of 2018. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of deja vu for me on multiple levels, that I was, again, after 50 years, having to face issues that I had faced, again, 50 years earlier as a student, and my parents and so forth had faced long before. One of the things I've been involved in recent years is working with Twin Cities Public Television, a partnership now that spans more than a quarter of a century. And producer Dan Bergen, who's a good friend and to some extent a mentee of mine, has put together a series of documentaries on local history, local African American history, but cross-cultural history as well. And we have been trying to, again, get this kind of information out of the classroom, out of scholarly textbooks and into the public domain via public television. So that's an ongoing enterprise of mine. Our most recent project is a documentary called This Free North, Black History at the University of Minnesota, that appeared this past fall and winter, and I hope will help draw some continuing attention. One of the signal things about that documentary is that we have images repeated in the documentary of drawn from the University of Minnesota's 1923 homecoming parade, in which the Ku Klux Klan had a float entered in the homecoming parade. All right. And Lotus Kaufman, again, as president, presided over that 1923 homecoming. And we have for the first time, a full image of that Ku Klux Klan float, again, with riders hooded and carrying shotguns. And the university has, to this point in time, as yet, to offer an explanation for the appearance of the Ku Klux Klan float in the homecoming parade, but that's some work that remains to be done. But the Minnesota Daily back in those days had published a series of articles, in fact, acknowledging that there was Klan activity at the university back then. It had been unimposed by the administration, and was akin to what was happening in other Big Ten college campuses in the North. Because those years, that decade of the 20s, was the height of Ku Klux Klan power in this country, and they were everywhere, and they were colonizing Minnesota and Wisconsin during those years.